The contractions had barely stopped 4 days earlier when my mother stood in my own living room and told me to get out. This is too much chaos for me right now, Emily. I raised my children already. I can't be doing this again at my age. She said it while my newborn daughter, Willow, slept in the bassinet 3 feet away, tiny fists curled up near her face the way newborns do, oblivious to the fact that her grandmother was standing over her mother delivering an ultimatum instead of admiring her. I sat on the couch, still moving carefully, still healing from the stitches, still running on almost no sleep and the particular fog that comes after 22 hours of labor followed by an emergency C-section none of us had planned for. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard, certain that sleep deprivation had scrambled something in my brain and turned an ordinary comment into something monstrous. "Mom, this is my house. It's the family house," she corrected, arms crossed tight over her chest, voice sharpening into the tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant the conversation was already over as far as she was concerned, no matter how it might still be unfolding for me. "Your father and I helped with the down payment. I think I'm entitled to some say in what happens under this roof, and right now what happens under this roof is too much noise, too much mess, too much of everything I don't have the energy for." I'd moved back in 8 months ago, pregnant and recently separated from my husband, Daniel, at my mother's own insistence. I remembered the phone call clearly, sitting in my old apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes, crying about the timing of it all, separated at 5 months pregnant, no idea how I'd manage alone. "Come home, sweetheart," she'd said, her voice warm in a way I hadn't heard in years, maybe since I was a teenager. "Let me take care of you. Let me help." Back then, the idea of a grandchild was still an abstraction to her, something to discuss over coffee with her book club friends, something to plan a nursery color scheme around on Pinterest, rather than something crying in a bassinet at 3 in the morning, something that needed feeding every 2 hours, something that made the whole house smell faintly of milk and diaper cream and disrupted every quiet routine she'd built over decades of empty nest living. I'd used what savings I had left after the separation, savings that should have gone toward a security deposit somewhere, toward building an independent life for myself and my daughter, to help cover the remaining mortgage payments on my parents' house instead, an arrangement she'd agreed to eagerly at the time, framing it as help rather than rent, family taking care of family. The two of us practically in tears at the kitchen table the day we worked out the details, hugging afterward like we'd solved something instead of merely postponed a reckoning neither of us had seen coming. Now, 4 days postpartum, stitches still healing, exhaustion sitting behind my eyes like sand, my milk barely in, my body still swollen and strange and unfamiliar to me. She wanted me gone. "Where exactly am I supposed to go, Mom? I have a newborn. I can barely walk to the bathroom without wincing, let alone pack up an entire life and find somewhere else to live in a week." "That's not my problem to solve," she said, and something in the flatness of her voice told me this wasn't a spontaneous outburst of sleep-deprived frustration, wasn't some momentary crack under the pressure of a newborn's crying at odd hours. This was decided, planned, even, delivered with the particular calm of someone who'd rehearsed it in the shower that morning, running through the words until they came out smooth and unshakable. "You have until the end of the week." I looked at Willow, still sleeping through all of it, mercifully unaware that her grandmother had just given her 4-day-old granddaughter an eviction notice alongside her mother. I thought about the mortgage payments I'd made every single month since moving back, transferred without complaint, without ever once being late, even the month I'd had to skip a doctor's appointment to make sure the numbers worked out. I thought about the nursery I'd painted myself, 7 months pregnant, balanced precariously on a step stool my mother had told me not to use. "You'll fall, Emily, be careful," though she hadn't offered to help either, hadn't picked up a paintbrush once, had simply stood in the doorway commenting on the color choice while I did all the physical work myself, belly heavy and back aching. I thought about every promise made when I was scared and pregnant and alone, promises whispered over cups of decaf tea at that same kitchen table, promises that had apparently expired the moment the baby actually arrived and turned out to be a real, loud, needy presence in the house rather than a theoretical future event to plan cheerfully around. "You knew this was coming, Mom," I said, my voice trembling now despite my best efforts to hold it steady. You knew for 8 months a baby was coming. This isn't a surprise. Why does it suddenly feel like one to you? Knowing something is coming and living through it are two different things, she said, and there was something almost defensive in the way she said it, like she resented having to explain herself at all, like the explanation itself was an inconvenience layered on top of the inconvenience of a crying newborn disrupting her mornings. I forgot how loud they are. I forgot how little sleep everyone gets. Your father needs his rest, Emily, with everything going on with his health, and I can't have him woken up every 2 hours by an infant that isn't even. She stopped herself there, but I heard the end of that sentence anyway, hanging in the air between us, even unfinished. That isn't even really ours to worry about. Give me until end of week, I said quietly, because arguing further in that moment felt pointless. Felt like throwing myself against a decision that had already calcified before I'd even opened my eyes that morning. But I want you to understand something, Mom. When I go, I'm not leaving quietly. I'm leaving with everything I'm actually owed. She scoffed, already turning to leave the room, already dismissing me the way she dismissed most things I'd said since I moved back in, treating my concerns like the overreactions of an emotional daughter rather than legitimate grievances that deserved actual attention. Don't be dramatic, Emily. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. I wasn't being dramatic. I was, for the first time in 8 months, being exact, though I didn't yet know precisely what that exactness would require of me. I sat there on the couch for a long time after she left the room, listening to her footsteps retreat down the hallway, listening to the particular silence that settled afterward, broken only by Willow's soft, even breathing in the bassinet beside me. I thought about calling Daniel, though our separation made that feel complicated in ways I didn't have the energy to untangle at 4 days postpartum. I thought about calling my older brother, Mark, though I already suspected he'd side with our mother the way he always did, minimizing my concerns with some version of "she's just stressed, cut her some slack," the same refrain he'd offer my whole life whenever our mother's behavior needed defending. Instead, I sat quietly with my daughter, feeling the particular ache of stitches and exhaustion and betrayal all tangled together in my chest, and I began, slowly, to think, not about where I might go, not yet, but about what, exactly, I had actually built here over the past 8 months, and whether any of it belonged to me in ways my mother hadn't fully considered when she gave me a week to disappear. That night, once Willow finally settled into a stretch of sleep long enough for me to think clearly, I sat cross-legged on my bed with the baby monitor humming softly beside me and pulled out the folder of documents I'd kept in my nightstand since the separation. Documents my divorce attorney had helped me organize months ago, back when I still assumed the hardest part of this year would be untangling myself from Daniel rather than untangling myself from my own mother. Among them was something I hadn't fully processed the significance of until now, a printed record of every mortgage payment I'd made toward this house over the past 8 months, transferred directly from my checking account into my parents' joint account, totaling just over $11,000. Money I'd contributed under the explicit understanding, texted and emailed and discussed at length across a dozen conversations at that same kitchen table, that it was going toward our arrangement. My mother's own words, an arrangement that implied some form of equity, some form of stake, not simply rent paid to a landlord who could decide on a whim that 4 days postpartum was the right moment to change the terms entirely. I scrolled back through old texts on my phone, feeling something harden in my chest with each message I reread. Just Venmo it, same as usual, sweetheart. It's really helping us with the mortgage this year. Don't worry about renter's insurance. You're not a renter, you're family. This is an investment in your future too. When the baby comes, we'll figure out how the space works. Don't stress about that part. 8 months of reassurance. All of it evaporating apparently the moment reassurance became inconvenient. I called my attorney, Rena, first thing the next morning, Willow strapped to my chest in a wrap because it was the only way she'd settle while I worked, her small weight rising and falling against me as I paced my childhood bedroom, phone pressed to my ear. Rena listened to the entire situation without interrupting, the way good attorneys do, occasionally making a small sound of acknowledgement that let me know she was tracking every detail, and then, once I'd finished, she said the thing I badly needed to hear. You have documentation of the payments. You have text messages establishing intent, which matters more than people realize in situations like this. depending on your state's laws, and depending on how explicitly the arrangement was framed, that could constitute an equitable interest in the property, or at minimum grounds for a reimbursement claim if she tries to remove you without compensating you for what you've already contributed. But Emily, before we go down the legal road, which can get expensive and slow fast, is there anything else at stake here? Anything else in that house that's actually yours, structurally on paper? I sat with the question for a moment, rocking slightly out of habit, even though Willow was already asleep, my mind sifting back through the past several years of my relationship with my parents, searching for anything I might have forgotten in the fog of pregnancy and separation, and now new motherhood layered on top of each other like sediment. And then, slowly, it surfaced. A memory I hadn't thought about in months, tucked away behind everything more urgent that had happened since. "There's a family trust," I said slowly, the pieces reassembling themselves as I spoke. "My dad's Parkinson's diagnosis, 2 years ago. His neurologist recommended getting his affairs in order early, while his judgment was still completely reliable, in case things progressed faster than expected. My mom asked me to help set it up, not my brother, me specifically, because I was the one who understood the paperwork and had the patience to sit through all the meetings with the estate attorney. I remember signing something. I remember being listed as co-trustee alongside my mom, so that if anything happened to my dad, or if my mom herself became unable to manage things, there'd be someone else with legal authority already in place. I stopped, my heart picking up pace. I think the house itself might actually be held in that trust. They transferred several assets into it for estate planning purposes. I remember discussing the house specifically because of the mortgage. If that's true, Rena said, her voice sharpening with the particular focus I recognized from our earlier conversations about the divorce, and if you're listed as co-trustee with equal signing authority, then your mother cannot unilaterally make decisions about that property. Not who lives there, not who's removed from it, nothing regarding its use or disposition, without your consent as co-trustee. She may not even be aware of the implications of what she set up, especially if it's been 2 years since she thought about the actual mechanics of it. People sign these documents during a crisis and then forget the details once the crisis passes. I felt something shift inside me, some tight coil of dread loosening slightly for the first time since my mother had stood over my couch and told me to leave. "I need to find that paperwork."
"Find it," Rena said.
"And, Emily, don't confront her until you have it in hand and I've reviewed it." Knowledge without proof just gives her time to prepare a counterargument. Knowledge with proof in front of her gives her nowhere to go. It took me the better part of 2 days, moving carefully around the house with Willow napping in short, unpredictable stretches, to locate the paperwork, not in the obvious filing cabinet in my father's old study, which my mother had reorganized at some point and which yielded nothing useful, but in a fireproof lockbox tucked in the back of my parents' bedroom closet. The same lockbox I remembered my mother mentioning once in passing, years ago, as the place she kept the important things. I felt strange going through it, some old childhood instinct flaring that I wasn't supposed to touch my parents' private belongings, but I reminded myself, firmly, that I wasn't stealing anything. I was looking for documents with my own name on them, documents I'd signed myself, documents that established rights I hadn't fully understood I still held. I found it near the bottom, beneath insurance policies and my father's old military discharge papers, a manila folder labeled, in my mother's handwriting, Trust, EST Planning, containing the original trust agreement drafted 2 years earlier. My hands were shaking slightly as I read through it at the kitchen table late that night, Willow finally down for what I hoped would be a longer stretch, the house quiet around me except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. The language was there, exactly as I'd remembered it, though the specifics were sharper and more consequential than my hazy 2-year-old memory had preserved. The house, this house, the one my mother had just given me a week to vacate, had indeed been transferred into the trust for estate planning purposes, specifically to protect it from being liquidated or mismanaged should my father's condition progress in ways that compromised his own decision-making. My mother and I were listed as co-trustees, with explicit language requiring both signatures for any major decision regarding trust property, including but not limited to sale, transfer, occupancy determination, or structural modification. Occupancy determination. My mother, it seemed, had also forgotten this particular clause, or perhaps she'd simply assumed that motherhood and postpartum exhaustion had made me too tired, too distracted, too desperate to remember what power I actually held over the very roof she was trying to push me out from under. She was wrong. I photographed every page of the document that night with trembling hands, sent the images to Rena before I let myself sleep, and lay awake afterward in the dark, Willow's soft breathing filling the monitor beside me, feeling something new settle into my chest alongside the exhaustion and the grief. Not triumph, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to the quiet certainty of someone who'd just discovered, in the middle of her worst week, that she wasn't nearly as powerless as she'd been told. I didn't leave at the end of the week. Instead, I spent the remaining days quietly preparing, gathering every document Rena asked for, printing bank statements that traced each of the $11,000 I'd contributed, organizing text message screenshots into a folder labeled simply evidence, a word that still felt strange applied to conversations with my own mother. I moved through the house differently during those days, not with the fragile deference of a guest waiting to be told when to leave, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who'd finally remembered she had somewhere to stand. My mother, for her part, seemed to interpret my silence as compliance. She hummed while she made coffee in the mornings. She mentioned, almost cheerfully, that her friend Carol knew of a lovely little apartment complex nearby that took applications quickly, as though she were doing me a favor by researching my displacement for me. I said little in response, just nodded and thanked her for the information, and let her believe the version of events where I'd quietly accept whatever timeline she decided on. On the 7th day, I called a family meeting, my mother, my father, and myself, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast as a child, where my mother had once helped me with algebra homework before all the softness between us calcified into something colder and more conditional, where she'd hugged me the day we set up our mortgage arrangement 8 months ago, as though we were solving something together instead of merely postponing a reckoning neither of us had seen coming. I'd asked my father to be there specifically, and I watched my mother's face flicker with something like unease when she realized I'd made that request deliberately rather than incidentally. My father, slower now, more careful in his movements since the Parkinson's progressed, settled into his chair with the quiet, careful attention of a man who sensed something significant was about to happen but hadn't yet been told what. "I've spoken with an attorney," I said, keeping my voice steady despite Willow fussing softly in her carrier beside me, my hand automatically reaching down to pat her back in the same steady rhythm I'd learned over the past 4 days. "And I want to make sure everyone in this room understands the actual situation because I don't think Mom fully remembers it and I don't think Dad's ever fully known it." My mother's face had already tightened, some instinct telling her what was coming, though I don't think she yet understood the specifics. "This house is held in the family trust Dad and I set up 3 years ago." I slid the photographed documents across the table, printed now, clean and undeniable. "I'm a co-trustee. That means any decision about this property, who lives here, what happens to it, whether it's sold or maintained, who's asked to leave, requires my signature just as much as it requires Mom's. She can't unilaterally decide to remove me from a property I have equal legal authority over. Not without violating the terms of the trust itself, which, for the record, was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral decision-making since Dad's diagnosis." My father picked up the document slowly, his hands trembling slightly with a tremor that had become more pronounced over the past year, and read through them with the careful, deliberate attention I remembered from childhood, back when he used to review my report cards with the same unhurried focus. "I remember this," he said quietly, looking up at my mother. "Margaret, I remember signing this. I wanted Emily protected in case anything happened to either of us. I wanted her to have a say." "That's not what this is about, Robert." My mother's voice had gone tight, defensive in a way I rarely heard from her, the careful composure she usually wore like armor slipping at the edges. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and something in his voice, tired, confused, genuinely searching, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. Because it sounds like our granddaughter is 4 days old, and you told our daughter to find somewhere else to live. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me instead of him, as though I were the safer target for whatever she needed to say next. You wouldn't use your father's trust against me. I'm not using it against you, I said, and I meant it, though I understood how it might feel that way to her. I'm using it to protect my daughter and myself from being put on the street 4 days after childbirth because you decided, apparently overnight, that a crying baby was more disruption than you were willing to tolerate. I've contributed over $11,000 toward this mortgage over the past 8 months, under an explicit understanding, in writing, that it constituted an equity arrangement, not simple rent paid to a landlord who could change the terms whenever it became inconvenient. I have the documentation. I have the texts. If you'd like to fight me on this, we can absolutely go that route, and I think if you're honest with yourself, you know how that would end, because Dad's attorney drew up those trust documents specifically anticipating disputes just like this one, disputes where someone's judgment might become compromised or self-serving in ways that hurt the rest of the family. My judgment is fine, my mother snapped, some of her old sharpness returning, though it sounded thinner now, less certain of its own footing than it had a week ago in the living room. Then explain to Dad why you gave me a week to vacate a house I helped pay for days after major surgery, without discussing it with him first, I said quietly. Explain why you did it while I was still bleeding, Mom. Explain why Willow's crying was the thing that finally broke your patience, when you had 8 months to prepare for exactly this. My father set the papers down slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him in years, not since before the diagnosis had softened so much of his usual directness. Margaret, what is she talking about? What happened while I was resting upstairs? My mother didn't answer him. Not really, just sat there with her hands folded tight in her lap, staring at the table like it might offer some escape route from a conversation she clearly hadn't expected to have to survive, especially not with him present, especially not with the trust documents laid out plainly enough that there was no version of events left to construct where she came out looking reasonable. The silence stretched long enough that Willow began fussing in earnest, and I lifted her from the carrier, settling her against my shoulder, grateful for the small, warm weight of her, grateful for something uncomplicated to focus on while the rest of the room sorted through years of unspoken tension all at once. I'm not asking to stay forever, I said, softer now, because some part of me still ached for the mother she used to be, before exhaustion and health scares and whatever fear had made her decide her own granddaughter was too much trouble to accommodate. I'm asking for what's fair. I'll find my own place on my own timeline when Willow and I are actually ready, not because I was pushed out 4 days postpartum with stitches still healing. And going forward, I want it clearly understood in writing exactly what my equity contribution here has bought me, so this never happens again to me, and so it never happens to anyone else you decide is suddenly too inconvenient to house.
She didn't apologize that day.
I hadn't expected her to. Not really. Not with my father sitting there absorbing the full shape of what she'd tried to do while he rested upstairs, unaware. But something shifted in the balance of the room after that meeting, some quiet redistribution of authority that hadn't existed a week earlier. My father, over the following days, began asking more questions about the trust, about the mortgage arrangement, about what exactly had transpired while his own health had occupied so much of the household's attention that he'd missed the erosion happening around him. My mother grew quieter, more careful, no longer humming over her morning coffee, no longer mentioning Carol's lovely apartment complex. 3 months later, when Willow and I finally moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment I'd found on my own, fully healed, fully rested as much as any mother of a 3-month-old can be, I left with a signed agreement reflecting my full equity share repaid from the trust, enough to cover first and last month's rent and a security deposit, with several thousand left over to start an actual savings account in Willow's name, something I'd promised myself I'd do the moment I had any stability to build on. My father drove over that first weekend with a truckload of furniture from his own garage, an old dresser, a rocking chair he'd apparently kept in storage since I was a baby myself, insisting I take it for Willow's room. My mother didn't come with him. Not that day, though she called a week later, her voice careful and smaller than I remembered it being my whole life, asking if she could visit, asking if she could see the baby somewhere that wasn't fraught with the weight of everything that had happened. I said yes, eventually, cautiously, the way you agree to something you're not sure you're ready for, but suspect you'll regret refusing outright. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully. But it was a door left open rather than closed for good, which felt, given everything, like the most honest thing I could offer either of us. I left that house, in the end, on my own terms, holding my daughter in one arm and a folder of paperwork in the other, having protected exactly what I was owed, not out of spite, not out of some desire to punish the woman who'd raised me, but because some things, once you've fought for them clearly enough, once you've proven to yourself that you're capable of standing your ground even 4 days postpartum and utterly exhausted, you simply don't have to fight for twice. Willow would grow up knowing, eventually, the whole complicated story of her first week alive. And I intended for that story to end, clearly and unmistakably, with her mother refusing to be pushed out of anywhere ever again.